Good morning. Today's presentation on navigation is the third in the Accessible Ohio Playbook 6-part webinar series. My name is Tanya Vela, and I am the Accessible Ohio Specialist for the Southeast area of the state. Presenting alongside me today is my colleague, Julia Wagner. Would you like to introduce yourself and explain the accessibility features of today's webinar?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Julia, and I am the Southwest Accessible Ohio Specialist and an occupational therapist. We plan for accessibility from the start. We use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the resource guide in PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text known as alt text to visual images. Also, in our delivery, we mention each other by name as the conversation goes back and forth to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. After the webinar, we edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. We also include a reasonable accommodation statement in our invitation to the webinar. So if attendees need an accommodation, they know who to contact to ask. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone. Tanya, can you give the attendees an overview of our webinar series?
Absolutely. The Accessible Ohio Playbook 6-part webinar series started with the fundamentals, which described 3 main fundamentals to consider when designing and enhancing the accessibility and inclusion of all environments. This included the Accessible Ohio Priorities, the American with Disabilities Act, known as the ADA, and universal design. The second session on planning and awareness included best practices for creating accessible websites, ideas for communicating the accessibility features an organization offers, and strategies to train customer-facing staff on disability awareness and accessibility. The playbook continues today with the third priority, navigation. In this session, we'll share information about the Accessible Ohio Initiative and how we can be a resource to Ohio's businesses, communities, venues, attractions, and employers throughout the services we offer. We will also provide an overview of the priority navigation. We will then discuss ideas for accessibility features and universal design concepts related to navigation. Throughout the webinar, we'll demonstrate how Accessible Ohio can connect our partners with best practices for accessibility and inclusivity. The next 2 webinars in the series will each highlight one of the Accessible Ohio's remaining priorities, experience and personal care. They will provide an overview of the priority, give ideas for accessibility features and universal design concepts, and share how Accessible Ohio can be a resource. The last session is called the Game Plan, and we will address how to establish and prioritize goals for accessibility and inclusion, and then create a plan for achieving these goals. Julia, let's get things started with a brief overview of Accessible Ohio.
Sure. Accessible Ohio specialists partner with employers, businesses, communities, venues, and attractions to help identify barriers, establish goals for accessibility, connect them with resources for accessibility enhancements, and provide information about potential funding sources. Our team's mission is to prioritize accessibility from the start, promote inclusiveness, and ensure everyone can experience Ohio in an equitable way. We strive to move beyond the minimum guidelines of the ADA and focus on universal design, both of which are addressed throughout this webinar series. Accessible Ohio specialists provide consultations, education, and resources.
Julia, because accessibility touches everything we do, we'd like to describe it as a journey we are all on. To help Accessible Ohio partners prioritize where to start and plan their next steps, we've organized accessibility into 3 main fundamentals. This begins with our Accessible Ohio priorities, which include planning and awareness, navigation, experience, and personal care. Then we continue with guidance from the ADA, and to a larger extent, the concepts included with universal design. This webinar focuses specifically on the second priority, navigation, to create an environment that is accessible, inclusive, and welcoming to all. So let's kick things off by describing this priority.
Great idea, Tanya. In the planning and awareness priority, we shared ideas for planning a visit to a venue, like reviewing an accessibility webpage, accessibility map, or social narrative. Once a person decides to go to the venue, the next priority focuses on getting there. So navigation is about the process of arriving, entering, and moving throughout the space. Today, we will discuss the ADA guidelines and universal design practices for these to be accessible for everyone. We will also address general elements which apply to all these areas like lighting, signs, wayfinding, and assistive technology. The session will conclude with information about how these elements can enhance accessibility and create a culture of inclusion. To get everyone involved in thinking about accessible navigation, think about a time you've been in the community and have observed a barrier, whether this was finding a parking spot, entering a store, or moving throughout an environment. We'd love to hear any examples where you observed a barrier to navigation or observed solutions that made navigation better. While you are entering your observations into the chat, I have an example I'd like to share. I recently traveled to the local park I often visit to hike with my dog. When I arrived, the main pathway to the trailhead was closed due to water damage. At first, I was concerned about how I would get to the trailhead. In fact, I was just about ready to turn around and head home when I noticed signs indicating another pathway to get to the trailhead. While I am typically hesitant to go on new paths with my dog, the signs were reassuring because they provided me with clear directions of where to go and how far I needed to travel to reach the trailhead. I followed the path with the guidance of the signage and arrived at the trailhead. I really appreciated the efforts taken by the park to ensure I could safely find and access the path I planned to use.
Okay, Julia, let's see what's coming in through the chat. Okay, we have an example here from insufficient crossing time at traffic signals when crossing the street to enter the venue. That is definitely a barrier and can make somebody feel very uneasy or unsafe when there isn't enough time. Uneven sidewalks, that's another barrier that can impact a community's accessibility. Let's see, anybody else have any other thoughts? Okay, Julia, thank you for sharing, and thanks to everybody out there for their participation.
Yes, we appreciate your responses. Tanya, can you break down the parts of navigation for us by starting off with the first area?
Yes, Julia. The first area of navigation is arriving. When we arrive at a venue, we typically either search for the parking lot to find a place to park, or if we've arrived through a ride share or public transportation, we exit the vehicle at the drop-off area and then make our way to the entrance. Navigating to the entrance often leads to encountering a change in level to access a sidewalk. And so the third area of arriving we like to discuss include curb ramps. We're going to discuss each of these areas and the practices that help to ensure these arrival spaces are accessible. So let's talk about parking. The ADA outlines some key elements for us. They provide guidelines on the required number of accessible parking spaces per parking lot, the dimensions of the parking space, and the specifications on van accessible parking space and access aisles. It is best to locate accessible parking spaces on the shortest route to the main entrance. When considering accessibility for vans, it's important to include an access aisle which provides individuals using wheelchairs or walkers with adequate space to unload and access their mobility device. The ADA also provides a helpful checklist for businesses to use to easily determine whether their parking lot meets the minimum requirements. A key component of accessible parking is proper signage. Because signage impacts arriving and entering and navigating a space, we will share best practices for signs in more detail later in the webinar. As it relates to parking, signage can help visitors find the accessible parking lot and identify the accessible spaces. The ADA indicates to use the International Symbol of Accessibility. It's the sign with the blue background and the white outline of a person using a wheelchair. In the photo on the slide, this is painted on the actual parking space. This sign is used to indicate a parking space is accessible and reserved for individuals with disabilities. These elements help create an accessible environment for individuals with disabilities arriving at a venue.
Tanya, I have an inclusive practice to share to ensure these accessible spaces stay accessible. You mentioned the requirement for accessible van parking spaces to have an access aisle for loading and unloading items like mobility devices. I'm sure we've all noticed these aisles sometimes become obstructed with items like shopping carts. One way to avoid this is to train staff to periodically scan the parking lot and remove items that are obstructing these spaces. I've also seen some places use a universal design approach with their parking lot. One venue included van accessible parking spaces throughout, creating equal access for all parking lot users. This aligns with the universal design concept, equitable use, which means the design is usable by all. For example, it can be helpful for an individual with children needing that extra space to safely load and unload kiddos into a stroller. Some people utilize a ride share or bus to arrive at a venue. What about drop-off areas?
Julia, drop-off areas are another component of parking. These are the designated areas for safe loading and unloading of passengers arriving through ways like a rideshare or public transportation. There is ADA guidance for drop-off areas, which address designating the space with signage and painted stripes on the ground surface. There's some important elements to consider as well for creating an inclusive drop-off area. One is to provide a covered area with an accessible seat or bench to rest while waiting, or to be protected from the weather, or perhaps to take care of a task such as getting an admission ticket out of your wallet. Another is to ensure the drop-off area is clear of protruding objects, grates, and/or maintenance holes. Examples of objects that can protrude into the space include misplaced trash bins or shrubs, or perhaps tree limbs. It's remembered to include an adjacent curb, which can be helpful for individuals who need a higher surface for entering and exiting the vehicle. So once we park or get dropped off, the next step is to find the entrance to the venue. To get there, we need to access the sidewalk from the parking lot. Curb ramps can provide access between the parking lot and the path to the venue. Let's discuss curb ramps in more detail. Julia, what can you tell us?
Well, Tanya, curb ramps are an essential component of access for people entering or exiting a sidewalk. Curb ramps provide access between two surfaces of varying heights, like the parking lot and the sidewalk. This enables people using mobility devices like wheelchairs and scooters, families pushing children in strollers, and customers pushing carts of product to navigate with ease between the parking lot and sidewalk. Curb ramps are often referred to as curb cuts. We see curb ramps also at street crosswalks and intersections. You may have noticed curb ramps often include raised bumps that are a different color from the sidewalk. These are called truncated domes, and they serve as an indicator to a person who is blind or has low vision that there is a transition to and or from a parking lot or street. For more information about curb ramps, the U.S. Access Board resource Guide to the ADA Accessibility Standards has a chapter dedicated to accessible routes, which outlines information about curb ramps. This includes the variety of curb ramps, different scenarios they may be used in, and specific guidelines when including them. Okay, now that we have used the curb ramp to reach the sidewalk, we are now on the sidewalk and approaching the entrance to the venue. What occurs next, Tanya?
Julia, we are now ready to enter the place we came to visit. This involves navigating through the entrance, which includes more than just the door. The areas we'll highlight include sidewalks, entrances, and doors and gates. So let's start with the sidewalk. Once an individual arrives, they navigate to the entrance by way of an accessible route. An accessible route connects the arrival areas to the entrance. The ADA provides guidance on accessible routes, and we'll discuss these later. However, we'll share a few key points about sidewalks now. The sidewalk leading to the venue should be smooth, have the proper incline, and be regularly maintained to ensure that it is accessible. In Ohio, at certain times of the year, snow and ice can make a sidewalk inaccessible for everyone. Other considerations to make related to providing clearance space for traveling, maneuvering, and passing others on the route. When a business ensures the route to their entrance is accessible, safe, and free of obstacles, it sends a message to visitors that they prioritize accessibility. In some instances, the path to the main entrance includes steps, which can be a barrier to accessibility. We have an example to share about a flower shop where this was the case. The entrance to the flower shop included a short, narrow stone path, which led to 8 steps to the main door. Because the business prioritized accessibility, they wanted to find a solution to this barrier. While the initial thought may be to install a ramp, there are times where this is not an effective solution. We will discuss why this is a factor when we talk about ramps later in the webinar. In this instance, the flower shop was limited in their options due to a lack of space leading up to the front entrance from the street. The business decided to create an accessible path leading to a side entrance of the flower shop. They used the ADA guidance along with best practices to determine how to implement the specifications of an accessible pathway. And the final result was a flat sidewalk space that was wide enough to accommodate an individual using a wheelchair or a family pushing a stroller to approach the entrance. This is only one aspect of the flower shop's efforts to become more accessible. We will revisit it throughout the rest of the webinar. Julia, would you like to begin our next area about entrances?
I would be happy to. The ADA highlights some important components of an accessible entrance. The first is the minimum number of accessible entrances required. Another is regarding the landing space outside the entry door. An accessible landing space includes adequate room for an individual using a mobility device to wait while the entry door swings open without the door crossing into their space. Additionally, entities should ensure their security barriers are installed in areas which do not block the accessible entrance. And remember to incorporate visual and audible signals at secure entrances, which require keypad entry or two-way communication systems like buzzers. Ideally, the main entrance of a venue is accessible. However, this is not always possible, as shown in our example with the flower shop. According to the ADA, if the main entrance is not accessible, the business and/or venue should provide a sign, including the international symbol of accessibility and a directional arrow to indicate where the accessible entrance is located. Tanya, one way entities can further enhance the inclusivity of their entrance is to provide shelter, like an awning, so individuals can be protected from the weather. Additionally, businesses can prevent potential barriers by placing trash cans, flower planters, or other items in an area that does not interfere with the landing space. Okay, now let's take it to the next part of entering, doors. Going back to the flower shop example, they had concerns not only about how visitors could get to their door, but the door itself. The components of accessible doors we will discuss include door pulls, known as door hardware, opening force, which considers the effort required to open the door, the space needed to maneuver opening and passing through the door, and the threshold to clear to travel through the doorway. Let's start with door hardware. It is best practice to incorporate a lever door pull. This permits operating the door with one hand without requiring a tight grasp or twisting of the wrist to open the door. A vertical door pull provides options of where to grasp. Next, we want to consider the opening force, which is the effort it takes to open the door. The ADA provides guidance on the maximum physical effort it can require to open a door. This can be impacted by the weight of the door, the type of door closer installed, or problems with the door, such as warping. To support individuals using mobility devices, the ADA outlines the required maneuvering clearance when opening doors and traveling through a doorway. This is also beneficial for individuals pushing strollers, individuals transporting large items, and more. It's also important to consider the threshold. A threshold is what we maneuver over when we go through a doorway. Sometimes these are flush with the floor and sometimes they are raised. When a threshold is too high, it creates a barrier for individuals using mobility devices. Rugs may also pose an accessibility barrier. It is important to ensure a rug has a low profile and the edges adhere to the floor to prevent someone tripping and allow mobility devices to safely move over it. The flower shop decided to install automatic doors, which eliminated most of their concerns with their entrance. This modification for the flower shop visitors integrates the first principle of universal design, equitable use. The automatic doors enable a parent pushing a child in a stroller, a shopper with their arms full of bags, and an individual using a mobility device to enter or exit the flower shop. Okay, I think this would be a good time to pause for a Q&A opportunity for our audience. Julie Wood, the Accessible Ohio manager, will be joining us for the question and answer portions of this webinar. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand. Also, we did receive some pre-submitted questions during the registration process for today's webinar. Julie, while we are waiting for questions in the chat, will you share a pre-submitted question?
Sure, Julia. Hi, everyone. This is Julie. Our first pre-submitted question is asking about revolving doors at front entrances and how can we make these accessible. So we know from the guidelines from the ADA that the revolving door is not accessible and should not be on the accessible route. So some possible considerations might be to reconstruct the entrance to make it accessible. Consider whether another door could be added beside the revolving door that is accessible, or to consider a different entrance that is accessible like the flower shop did with creating an accessible route to get to that entrance and including the proper signage. Julia, what additional ideas do you have?
Yeah, Julia, I do have some ideas. There are a few different options that can be considered, but just really that the solution would be determined on a case-by-case basis on the business's unique situation. As mentioned earlier, when there is an additional entrance, there's an accessible entrance, the entity should include signage that directs visitors to let them know where the accessible entrance is. And something else to consider as well is ensuring the doors for the accessible entrance are open at the same time as all the other doors for entrances to the building.
Thank you, Julia. We do have a question in the chat from Rosemarie. Thank you, Rosemarie. The question is, does the business have to keep the door unlocked at the accessible entrance? And so the answer to that is really going to be case by case. You would look at the guidance, you would look at your unique situation, and during your open hours, talk with your security. If there's a reason that it needs to be locked, then you would certainly want to provide accessible ways that individuals visiting your venue can let you know that they are there, and having more than one format to make that request. So thank you for that question. I do see one, or I don't see any more in the chat. So one more pre-submitted question that we received is about pop-up children's festivals and wondering about how to make pathways and accessing a temporary stage accessible. That's a great question, and certainly our consultation services apply to permanent businesses, but also to temporary spaces and events as well. And Tanya, I know that you have consulted on this very topic. So what would you like to share?
Sure, Julie. With this particular question, we would be able to provide some information regarding temporary accessible pathways and the different methods to consider for creating access to the stage. Lifts and ramps are an option, and we'll be talking about those in a little bit.
Thank you, Tanya. Some more questions coming in through the chat from Janice. Is the state considering a consistent way that people can request how to lengthen signal crossing times? There doesn't appear to be a consistent way for folks to do this. To address this, I'd just like to share the spirit of Accessible Ohio is to work in partnership with businesses, communities, venues, and attractions that are working towards increasing their accessibility, and they reach out to partner with us, and we can connect them with helpful resources to address all of the aspects of accessibility that touch their business or their venue. So thank you for that question. The second one is saying, I've noticed some businesses only offer painted accessible parking spots. In the winter, it can be hard to see these painted spots in the snow. Are there ways we can request for a sign to be installed at businesses that don't offer both a sign and a painted parking spot? One of the best practices that we share with the businesses that we consult with is to organize their accessibility features that they offer onto one page called an accessibility web page, so that their visitors have one place to go to find out all of the ways that they provide accessibility. And something to include on that is a statement of who to contact if you encounter a barrier and would like to address that. And so I would encourage you to maybe look at the websites to see if that statement is available and shares who to contact. Certainly, when we consult through Accessible Ohio, we share the best practices of signage so that that barrier of the snow covering the painted indicator is alleviated by also having an accessible sign. So thank you for that question. All right, that's the last in the chat. So Tanya and Julia, I will turn it back to you to continue.
Sure. So after the entrance, the next part of navigation is moving throughout the venue. The pathway through a venue may include outdoor and/or indoor spaces. We will be discussing components of navigation within a space that may include ramps, elevators, egress, and outdoor trails. Let's start with pathways. The ADA contains specific requirements regarding components of the accessible pathway, such as the running slope, width, passing areas, and turnaround spaces, and I'd like to highlight these. First, the running slopes of pathways throughout a venue should be gradual and meet ADA requirements. Using the appropriate width accommodates an individual using a mobility device, such as a motorized wheelchair, to maneuver safely on a path. Along the path, ensuring passing areas include space for individuals traveling in opposite directions to safely pass one another without stopping. Also, areas which involve maneuvering around an obstacle should include additional space in the pathway to facilitate safe navigation. The ADA also addresses the location of items in areas that impact the accessibility of pathways. So let's talk about what a clear path entails. A clear path takes into consideration the items placed on the floor surface and protruding from the walls. That means items should not be sticking out into the clear path or too far off the walls. When this isn't taken into consideration, it can cause a safety concern. For example, people who are blind and utilize a white cane for navigation may not be alerted to objects located outside of the range the cane can detect. When the path is clear, it creates an inclusive environment that is accessible. There's some other additional things to consider as well. Complex patterns and designs on a pathway can be overstimulating and potentially cause difficulty with balance or confusion. Julia, these are all important factors to consider when thinking about making pathways safe and accessible, which relates to the second principle of universal design, tolerance for error. This principle considers the safety of an individual when using a product or moving about an environment. So speaking of environments, let's take a moment to discuss outdoor trails.
Sure, Tanya. While a trail in the woods isn't exactly the same as a sidewalk or a path, there are some basic elements that apply to both. For example, the width of the path and the passing spaces are key elements to consider. Accessible outdoor trails can be made from a variety of surfaces to ensure the trail is firm and stable, and remember to keep the trail regularly maintained. Maintaining a trail involves ensuring the path is clear of large obstacles like fallen trees and addressing damage from erosion or flooding. The U.S. Access Board offers a guide to the Architectural Barriers Act accessibility standards that shares accessibility standards for outdoor recreation and trails. We often use this for our consultations with our partners. Okay, it's time to get off the trail. Another area I'd like to bring attention to, which we mentioned earlier in the webinar with the flower shop, is ramps. Ramps can replace or provide an alternate option to steps. When I think of a ramp, I can't help but picture the zero entry to a swimming pool at a water park, which provides a smooth transition into the water. Similarly, a ramp should provide a smooth segue into or out of an area. Ramps can be used inside and or outside and are made of wood, concrete, or metal. Let's revisit our flower shop example. If you recall, the flower shop had 8 steps leading up to their main door. After some consideration, they determined there was not enough space to provide the appropriate grade for a ramp. That is because there are specifications for the rise and run of a ramp that determine the length and angle to incorporate into the ramp design. The lower the grade or incline, the easier the ramp is to use. The flower shop is an example where it may be difficult to install a straight ramp, which provides the appropriate incline for individuals to safely use, and other options needed to be considered. Here are some ways to enhance the safety of a ramp. Include edge protection along the run of the ramp to prevent a wheel from falling off. Provide railings for people to grasp throughout the entire length of the ramp. And incorporate contrasting colors at the bottom and top of the ramp to indicate a change in surface and elevation. When an entire flight of steps is necessary to get to another floor, typically an elevator is needed. Tanya, can you elaborate on elevators?
Sure, Julia. When there are too many steps for a ramp to accommodate, an elevator should be considered. The features to consider for an accessible elevator include the width of the opening, audible and visual notifications of the arrival car, and the amount of time the door remains fully open. Providing the operative buttons with raised characters in Braille and audible features further enhances the accessibility. The ADA contains specific guidelines to achieve this. Did you know the sound an elevator makes are an indicator of which direction it's traveling? It beeps once when the elevator is going up and twice when the elevator is traveling down. At times, a platform lift can be a good option. The features to consider for an accessible platform lift are similar to those for an elevator. These include the width of the opening and the length of time the door remains open. Also, the lift must be self-operable by an individual. There are 2 kinds of platform lifts, a vertical and an incline. A vertical platform lift transports the individual up and down, while an incline platform lift follows the route of a set of steps. We've been talking all about how to get in and out of an area. I think we should mention how to get out of an area. What I'm referring to is more than just an exit. The term is egress, and it refers to the accessible route or routes to be used in case of an emergency. Building regulations and fire codes may dictate the primary entrance is not sufficient in crisis situations. For example, if there's a fire or another emergency at the main entrance, it will be critical for the venue to have an additional accessible means of exiting the building. So ensuring the proper number of entrances and exits are accessible is key to providing a safe exit route. The use of lighting, signage, and audible messaging systems can help convey directional information in emergencies. Also enabling the fail-safe mode, automatic doors, can allow their continued use even during a power outage. Staff that's been trained on these evacuation plans and features are more confident in assisting during an emergency. Okay, Julia, now we are going to discuss some of the common elements that can impact arriving, entering, and moving about a space.
Sounds good, Tanya. Some of these elements are categorized into what we call assistive technology. Assistive technology is similar to technology in that it makes things easier, more productive, or solves problems. The goal of assistive technology is to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of an individual. While it is designed to enhance accessibility specifically for people with disabilities, it can be useful for all of us. We're going to discuss assistive technology that relates to navigation, such as mobility device charging stations, lighting, signage, and wayfinding, which can be integrated to facilitate inclusive spaces. I'd like to start this section off by sharing some information about charging stations. When someone is using their power wheelchair in the community all day, it can be helpful to have a way to recharge a low battery. One way to do this is by using a charging station for power mobility devices, which can be located in a variety of places. One model we are familiar with is about the size of a notebook and can be plugged into a 110-volt power source. It can provide a boost charge in about 30 minutes to a power mobility device. Placing this accessibility feature at a venue or event can alleviate concerns a person using a mobility device can have regarding a low battery. It can positively impact how long somebody could stay at an event. There are some things to consider when installing charging stations, like locating charging stations on an accessible route, ensuring there is adequate floor space to approach and maneuver around the charging station, placing the charging plug where individuals using mobility devices can reach it, providing protection from sun and rain if the charging station is located outside, and installing the device in a central location where the individual is participating in an activity, so they have something to do while charging their power mobility device. One idea is to locate these in a food court area. A mobile charging station can be created by placing the unit on a cart with a power source, such as an audiovisual cart. This is useful for making temporary events more inclusive. Another element that can have a large impact on navigation is lighting. Tanya, can you tell us more about this?
Sure thing, Julia. Lighting is an important component of navigation. It can enhance the accessibility of an environment. I'd like to ask our audience to participate in our conversation now. Let's think about the three areas of navigation we've discussed: parking, entrances, and pathways. We invite you to weigh in on these statements about lighting. Please select true or false for each statement as they pop up. First one is, when you are outside, you can rely solely on natural light. True or false?
Okay, Tanya. Audience is weighing in. The majority of our audience felt that the statement was false.
And they are correct. At certain times of day, natural lighting does not provide enough light. For example, at dawn and dusk. Okay, are we ready for the next one? As long as you have a light source, the position of the light doesn't matter. True or false?
All right, audience is in the midst of participating. I'm seeing responses in both categories, but again, the majority of the audience felt that this statement was false.
And that also would be correct. The positioning of lighting can impact navigation, such as footlights in a theater, which are positioned near the floor to give visual direction and shape to the environment without impacting the theatrical performance, enables guests to safely enter and exit the room. So I'd like to thank everyone for participating in our little polls. And here is some more things that can impact lighting. Venues, for example, can strategically position lights to eliminate dark areas in parking lots, so individuals can park in any location and find their way to the destination. And as we mentioned in our polling activity, mentioning the footlights in a theater is another example. Automatic light switches can be installed to eliminate the need to physically manipulate an object or to turn on a light. This is particularly helpful when entering restrooms. Another automatic feature that can enhance a space is lighting systems that change throughout the day as the light varies. This can be helpful for areas which include plentiful of light, natural light. For example, a library may have a wall of windows, and in this case may not need bright overhead light throughout the day. Okay, Julia, I think I've shed enough light on this topic. What's another component of navigation that can affect accessibility of an environment?
Tanya, thanks for asking. I will take that as a sign to talk about signs. Similar to lighting, signs have an overall impact on how we navigate. Signs inform us of where to park, where the entrance is, and where to find things. To begin with, accessible signs should be simple and use plain language. Here are some features that make signs more useful. Use consistent text, style, and location throughout a venue. Use proper color contrast by having light images and words on a dark background or dark words and images on a light background. avoid shiny finishes to reduce glare, place raised characters in Braille below the visual words or images, and here are some considerations when including tactile enhancements like raised characters in Braille. Incorporate these on signs at doorways, restrooms, exit passageways, and elevators. Place them at a height that is within designated reach ranges, and ensure the size complies with ADA guidance for raised characters and font. The ADA outlines specifications for placement of signs, including at what height they should be located. There are also some technology tools that can be used in conjunction with signs to enhance communication, such as electronic message boards with visual and audio output. This is especially helpful for emergencies and public venues. Also, the use of QR codes on signage is becoming common. It is helpful to locate the QR code where it can be easily scanned by a smart device. Signage can be incorporated into wayfinding, which is another strategy to support navigation.
That's right, Julia. Wayfinding includes the strategies individuals use to orient themselves in a space and navigate throughout the space. Think about the last time you were in an unfamiliar place. It could have been an airport, a shopping center, a large amusement park, or someplace else. What did you use to assist in knowing where you were and how to get to your next stop? Does something such as a color or the shape of a sign give you a clue or an idea of where you were? If so, you tapped into the venue's use of wayfinding. Wayfinding strategies include a variety of design elements that, when incorporated, can enhance the ability of an individual to know where they are in a space and navigate throughout the area. It uses predictable and repetitive design components like colors, symbols, lighting, ceiling height, and other design elements. For example, indoor paths can utilize a simple color scheme for the flooring to indicate a designated area in a hospital. Some ways signs can enhance wayfinding include the use of communicating meanings, for example, a triangle to signal a warning, other directional arrows adding directional arrows along with arrows, that is what I'm trying to say, folks, along with words can increase clarity. We've mentioned universal design in prior webinars, and it's one of Accessible Ohio's fundamentals. Wayfinding touches on many of the principles and goals of universal design. The applications of wayfinding in universal design are helpful, and I encourage the audience to check out the service section on the Accessible Ohio webpage for more information, as we update our resources frequently. Another wayfinding tool uses technology. Julia, would you please give us some information on that?
Sure. There are a variety of ways to enhance navigation with technology. We probably are most familiar with GPS geolocation, but there are other tools which include indoor positioning systems, or IPS, LiDAR scanning technologies, beacons, Wi-Fi, and smart device apps. These tools are typically combined when in use. Let's share an example of how this works. Marcia, a person who is blind, uses an app on her smart device which connects to beacons that have been installed at her gym. When her smart device is within range of one of the beacons, the beacon provides a signal to her smart device, which then provides audio navigation and information through the app. These auditory messages continue as Marcia passes each beacon while navigating throughout the building. There are also apps that provide information about the most accessible routes for all abilities, with notes about stairs and if a bathroom is accessible. Technology is ever expanding, and apps are being updated and improved to further enhance how we navigate in our communities. Not only is technology expanding, but our awareness of the importance and impact of accessibility is growing as well. Tanya, can you share more about this?
Absolutely, Julia. In this webinar, we have touched on some different ways to enhance navigation, thus improving access to our environments. When we participate together, we feel connected and included. We'd like to share a story about an individual named Amanda and her experience in the community. We would like to ask the audience to take note of any aspects of Amanda's surroundings, which support inclusion, to discuss these ideas afterwards. Okay, now on to Amanda. Amanda is a mother of 2 children, a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old. Amanda's 10-year-old child has cerebral palsy and utilizes a wheelchair for mobility. Each week, they like to take a walk to the library from their house, which involves Amanda pushing the wheelchair along the half-a-mile of smooth sidewalk. She crosses several streets using well-maintained curb ramps. She passes several small shops and a cafe. There aren't obstacles such as a sandwich board or tables on the main path. She navigates the gradually sloped sidewalk to reach the automatic doors of the library. As she walks through the doors, she encourages her 6-year-old to go to the children's area of the library. Her 6-year-old utilizes the orange color schemes and pictures of foxes to find a way to the children's area. Amanda planned to take her 10-year-old to the history section on the library's 2nd floor. As they approached the elevator, she noticed a sign indicating that the elevator was out of order and that someone at the circulation desk could gather requested items. So Amanda requests the items. The area surrounding the circulation desk was open, included tables where they could sit. A few minutes later, the books were delivered. Amanda and her child enjoyed the remainder of the afternoon reviewing the books, while her 6-year-old enjoyed story time in the children's section. Now, we would like to hear from the audience as we reflect on Amanda's story. In this story, how did Amanda's different environments cultivate a culture of inclusion? Please raise your virtual hand or enter your responses in the chat.
Tanya, while we're waiting for our audience to pull some examples from the story, I had one that stuck out to me, and it was the mentioning of the small cafe shops and how there weren't sandwich board signs or tables on the main path. And I know that when I do have the opportunity to go in the community, that is something I certainly look for, because I always like to see what the different food options are. But looking at that and how, if that is crossing into the pathway, that could create a potential accessibility barrier. And so keeping that in mind to create an inclusive space to make sure that that pathway is clear. That stood out to me from the story.
That's a really great example. I'm not seeing much in our chat. So Julie, anything else was particularly standing out to you? Oh, we do have a response. Rosemarie points out the clear area at the desk. And this is really important, that spaces allow for movement between tables and around areas where people can congregate. So, and then the path to the library was extremely accessible with the curb cuts and the gradually sloped sidewalk. Oh, this person indicates that they think the sloped sidewalk is really important. And it makes them think about the intersectionality between accessibility and things like redesigning, I think, or redlining. Thank you for your comments. We also have somebody who noticed the colors in the fox shape. Yes, that's an example of wayfinding. So we were glad that somebody picked up on that. Let's see. Let's see what else. Providing seating areas for them to wait while the materials were gathered. And somebody liked the plan that there was a plan to, if the elevator was not being able to be used. So Julie, I'd really like to talk a little bit more about the importance of that sign on the elevator.
Yeah, we absolutely, it's a best practice to put all the accessibility practices in place, with the elevator, but there are at times where technology does not work. And so in this instance, the library provided an alternate means, which enabled people to receive the books on the 2nd floor, which is what they were hoping to be able to do. So, and with that, the sign indicating that the elevator was out of order, and then directing individuals to the circulation desk, would be a best practice as well to inform individuals of another accessible means of obtaining those books. So our audience identified a lot of accessible and universal design practices in Amanda's story.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for your ideas. I do think it is a good time for us to stop for another question and answer section before wrapping up the webinar. Julie will be joining us again for this portion. So if you'd like to ask a question, please enter it in the chat or raise your virtual hand. Julie, while we're waiting for questions in the chat, will you share a pre-submitted question?
Sure. One of the pre-submitted questions is asking about how to make a trail more accessible for an individual who is blind. Tanya, I know that you have been researching this very topic and had some interesting ideas that you could share with us today.
Sure. Trails can become more accessible for blind individuals in a variety of ways. One example is the utilization of a rope and bead system to create a braille trail. The individual is guided by the rope, which is strung along the pathway of the trail, and then beads are provided at intervals to indicate how far you are along the trail. Another idea is to use contrasting colors on the trail to indicate the path and distance markers. The contrasting colors helps individuals with low vision to identify the boundaries of the path. Both of these benefit a wide variety of individuals, including children and individuals who are neurodivergent. I think we have another pre-submitted questions, or do we have something in the chat?
We do have some coming into the chat, and there's one from earlier that I didn't catch before.
Okay.
So Jason had asked a question about whether or not we list the organizations that we're partnering with on our webpage. I just wanted to say this time we don't currently list the partners that we're working with. The spirit of Accessible Ohio is to partner with businesses and different organizations and venues who are seeking our services to find more information and be connected with those helpful resources to help continue on their journey. And so at this time, we're not putting those on the website, but thank you for your comment. And then I'm going to scroll back down to where the new questions are coming in. You mentioned turnaround space for wheelchairs, but I don't think specifics were given. Is there a standard amount of space for turning around after entering a doorway? I work at a historic site, and sometimes we struggle in this area because of having older, smaller buildings. Thank you for that question. We specifically don't provide the details of the technical information from the ADA, specifically because it can be so unique to each situation and the spaces that folks have. And so there's usually exceptions and things like that, or additional things to consider that's in the guidance. And so that would be better addressed through a consultation. But we hope through the webinar to just provide the information on the various aspects of a component of accessibility so that we're conveying all of the areas to consider. The next question, can you please provide a link to the place where we can view these webinars or share them with others? We can certainly do that. It was dropped in the chat earlier, and we can bring it down here because the chat's filling up. So yes, we archive all of our webinars, and those can be accessed in our on-demand library. A comment about making sure tree branches don't become protruding objects in the path as well. Absolutely. So training staff to be mindful of those kinds of barriers and to perform regular maintenance can be helpful. Not a question, just a comment from Amanda. I was at a university in Ohio and noticed their elevators have large plates at the bottom that people can use their feet to operate the elevator. So thought that was cool. Thanks for sharing that accessibility enhancement. Is there a charge associated with the consultation offered by the Accessible Ohio consultants? Great question from Janice, and our favorite thing to share, there is no cost for our services. Rosemarie has a question about, does a business need to have emergency evacuation chairs to help people get down the stairs? Emergency evacuation chairs are certainly something to consider as an accessibility enhancement for evacuation, and that is a resource we can share with our partners for them to consider when they are looking at that in their facility. And then we have another question. Oh, no, just a thank you. So let's go back to the final pre-submitted question. It is about wayfinding and multi-sensory strategies. to help a person navigate a space. Julia, I know we just talked about wayfinding and we're getting short on time, but do you mind adding a few thoughts about enhancing wayfinding?
Sure. Wayfinding can certainly help a person to navigate a space, and it's especially helpful when it uses more than one of our senses. So just for an example, a business could utilize purple signs pointing to the checkout, and they could also incorporate a lavender plant at the cash register. So with this example, you'd be utilizing both sight and smell senses. Another idea to consider would be perhaps playing music in a central location or lobby of the building to provide individuals with an auditory indicator of their location. So this would be an example of a sound, the use of the sense of sound to help with wayfinding and navigating to a certain space within the venue.
Great. Thank you, Julia. Thank you all so much for your questions. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Julia, again to conclude the webinar for us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. We enjoyed sharing Accessible Ohio's second priority, navigation, with you. To summarize, the navigation priority has three main parts: arriving, entering, and moving throughout the space. Each of these has their own unique components to consider and have common elements such as lighting and signage that can impact the accessibility of the space. We highlighted the benefits of accessible navigation, which can promote a culture of inclusion where everyone feels welcome. Remember, our Accessible Ohio specialists are available to meet with businesses, employers, communities, venues, and attractions throughout Ohio. We will listen to your needs, provide resources, and engage in an ongoing partnership as we work toward our mission to empower everyone to experience all our great state has to offer in an equitable way. Please contact the Accessible Ohio specialist in your region to start a partnership with us. Our contact information is on our webpage,